My name is Susan Martin. I'm from King's College London, and the panel today is on UK nuclear policy and practice. Our first speaker will be Tom Roberts, who's a systems engineer working on the Future Submarine Program, and today he's going to be speaking to us about how best to ensure that UK submarines will be available, safe, affordable, and capable. Our second speaker is Sophie McCormack. Sophie is finishing her MA in Applied Strategy and Security from the University of Exeter, and her topic for today is the British understanding of nuclear deterrence. And finally, we'll hear from Jana Wattenberg, a PhD candidate in the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth, and the Deputy Director at the David Davis Memorial Institute of International Studies. And she's going to be speaking to us, as her question prefigured, about the UK and the ban treaty. So Tom, why don't you kick us off?
Good morning. I think my presentation kicks quite nicely off from the keynote speech. I obviously have to start the presentation and say that these views are my own and not that of Babcock. So the recent vote in 2016 for sustainment of CASD showed overwhelming support for submarines. I hope my presentation today gives you a better insight into the support program that keeps these at sea. And I'd like you to think throughout the presentation as to what the impact of an effective support solution is on CASD and what the future could look like. Through-life performance is measured on availability, cost, and safety. But before we consider these, I'd like to think about the product and the programs. The product itself is low volume. There are only 4 of them. There wasn't a prototype. And they're complicated systems which enable them to carry out a demanding mission. They have to stay operational for a long time, and this is often due to political decisions made. And the cost is largely seen within the in-service phase. The programs are also costly, and there are obviously political implications of late delivery. This is CASD. It's a collaboration, and this obviously leads to complex management and a really complicated process. Just to give you guys a head for the figures, a deep maintenance period can be about 2.5 million labour hours and cost about 350 million. That's the equivalent of one person working a 10-hour day for about 685 years. It's obviously a global enterprise. It's also a national endeavour, and it's not just the companies you see as the headliners there. And we can't forget our commitment to NATO and our special relationship with the US. Given how expensive submarines are to maintain, operate, and build, mission availability has to be maximised. And this means we need to understand these readiness states, particularly the maintenance periods. The goal is obviously to send the submarine to sea with a fully trained crew, capable of a sustained mission with all the repairs done. Operational profiles built around system and resource constraints. But this enables the capability to be available as and when we need it. In real terms, that means we need to keep at least one of those submarines in that blue bar at all times. There are challenges to keeping this, though. Sustainment costs are the largest contributor to the whole life cost. Often support is a bolt-on or an afterthought thrown over the fence, and this negates our ability to provide a tailored package, particularly as we see that Boat 4 is likely to be very different from Boat 1, as we've already seen in the Astute class. That's often due to a lengthy build program. The term "it's not rocket science" doesn't really apply to these things. These are really complicated systems. They're built into a confined space, and they operate in one of the harshest environments we know. More is being demanded of submarines worldwide. There are significant LifeX programs on most of the world's SSBM fleet. And this calls for a tailored support approach. Here we see how the political decision can affect the platform life, particularly in respect to our earlier operating profile. As you can see, the V-class is expected to be operational for 15 years longer than its original service life. As the equipment gets older, it gets closer to the wear-out curve, and the material state of the boat often declines. This leads to a peak in resource requirement, as you can see in the graph, and often more maintenance. If a maintenance period is added or shifted, or we see an additional peak in support resource required, it could have a real knock-on effect, particularly if those facilities are shared with other classes. The aim is obviously to increase availability, optimise that cost, and maintain safety. And to do that, we really do need to design for support. What we gain from this approach is the ability to predict availability drivers. Designing for support and targets those improvements from component to equipment level. If we can predict maintenance requirements, we're able to tailor the training. We can also optimise spares, and that means the right parts are in the right place at the right time. Supportability analysis and availability modelling enables us to apply benefits to not only just a platform, but the whole class. Submarine support takes an ILS approach. Integrated logistics support is prevalent in the aerospace industry, but it's fairly new in the marine industry. Some attribute this to situations such as the Nimrod, which happened earlier, but there are successful examples of this. Eurofighter and F-35 both have ILS programs. Eurofighter is a brilliant example of a collaboration across countries. Identifying cost and availability drivers helps us to influence design early in the product lifecycle. As you can see in the graph, the cost is lowest during the concept and design phase, and this is the best point at which we can implement a support solution and integrate it. The cost of design change are going to rapidly increase as we leave design, as you can see in the blue arrow. But costs can be planned, and often a support solution is hindered by the decisions made during the design phase. Obviously, the platform is designed to fulfill the mission, but what I'm trying to show here is that the mission is a small part of the overall program that we're trying to simulate. Capability requires a set of building blocks which are handily defined by the Ministry of Defence Lines of Development, and they use the acronym TEPID OILI, if any of you know it, and it's the first letter of all the headings you see there. But it basically sets together the whole program and considerations you have across the enterprise. Often we simulate the will it do its job question, and that is just the mission. But as I said, the program now aims to simulate the rest of it to drive down that cost, improve safety, and give a greater availability of the platform. This gives us a mechanism for coordinating development of different aspects of capability. Together, these provide a real military capability. And because support analysis is fed by design, we can simulate against those requirements, and that gives us this supportability feedback loop back into the design. Class-level modelling allows us to forecast the ability of the submarine and the solution as a whole. Hopefully, this enables us to maintain that readiness profile, identify any risks, and optimise the performance. A bill of materials in the bottom left is assessed for the impact on capability, and it allows us to focus our supportability analysis on just those candidate items, and their support significant items. We link this in with a common database. It's linked, configured, and controlled, and it provides a single point of truth for all of our data. From component level all the way up to the class level, we can drill down to find those sources of lower availability and target them within the design phase where it costs less. Tools are also applied throughout the process, and these build our class availability prediction and a maintenance planning capability, and that shows us whether we can meet that operating profile we saw earlier in the presentation. In conclusion, in-service costs dominate the whole life costs, so why is investment not reflected in the concept phase? Performance modelling is cost-effective and accurate, particularly on a submarine that doesn't have a prototype. So for a product that's worth billions, is it not worth us investing in its care package? Future platforms could be the first defence acquisition programmes to apply this level of engagement within the design phase. These could be the most supportable platforms ever delivered to the UK. We have to prioritise design for support now to optimise that cost, increase availability, and maintain the safety of operation of the platform. Thanks for listening.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much, Sophie.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Sophie McCormack, and it is my pleasure to present to you this morning on British political understanding of the term nuclear deterrence. So, over the course of the next 10 minutes, I will take you through the key findings of my research. which primarily focuses upon a discourse analysis of the 2016 parliamentary debate to renew Trident. I will then focus more specifically on a wider discourse analysis of public statements made by Theresa May during her time as Prime Minister made on nuclear deterrence. Concerningly, very similar themes of conflating the concept nuclear deterrence with the object the nuclear deterrent, unquestioned assumptions, and a historical attachment to a policy born at the end of World War II occur across both sets of research. I will then discuss the implications of a lack of political understanding and outline some potential areas for progress. So, in the 2016 debate, in which MPs voted by a majority of 355 to renew Trident, different justifications were used for voting with the government, such as prestige and securing jobs. However, by far the most commonly used justification was that of deterrence. So I will outline three key themes from the debate. First is the worryingly common practice of the terms nuclear deterrence and the nuclear deterrent being used interchangeably. Now, I'm sure all of us in the room can appreciate that those two things are not the same. By conflating the concept nuclear deterrence with Trident the weapon, it immediately undermines any effective political analysis. By having this as a misplaced starting point for debate, it means that the ensuing conversation is unlikely to be constructive. Second is the prominence of lazy causal links. Now, this is perhaps not surprising, given the just mentioned political confusion over what is meant by the term nuclear deterrence. However, there is a worrying assumption that nuclear weapons in themselves are the only aspect to effective deterrence. Quotes such as, "Our deterrent is a deterrent," are littered throughout the debate, and such quotes demonstrate a lack of fundamental political questioning of key nuclear turns and approaches. Perhaps this argument is grounded in another assumption, that there is nothing to debate because nuclear weapons have been a pillar of the international system since the end of the Second World War. Historical precedent and a British Churchillian view of itself leads some politicians to argue for renewal based on arguments of because it has been. This also results in the debate being underpinned by a strong sense of pride, but this pride in itself further inhibits effective political analysis. Third is that anyone attempting to raise the questions of what do we mean by deterrence were labelled as a national security threat and it being a left-wing disarmament argument. Now, whilst those that raised those points were often arguing for disarmament, the fact that attempting to critically analyse nuclear policy was classed as a security threat presents a very dangerous precedent. To have UK nuclear policy built around the concept of deterrence, but without politicians being able to, or in fact even considering to, question what we mean by this, is an alarming precedent. In fact, there have been plenty of people very vocal about the dangers of groupthink since the Iraq War, yet the unquestioning collective approach to nuclear policy is not talked about in the same vein. Throughout the debate, there were explicit references to, and I quote, the love and joy of consensual nature of discussions. Overall, there appeared a very worrying lack of political understanding of the dynamic nature of deterrence and how best it could be achieved. So there are three key implications from these findings. First is that academic debate is seemingly not enhancing political understanding enough. Academic debate paints deterrence as a dynamic, multifaceted concept. By contrast, political debate is dominated by comments such as, Trident does what it says on the tin, it deters. Naturally, there is a separation between the academic and the political spheres. However, having such a sharp dichotomy cannot be to the benefit of nuclear policy. Think tanks attempt to bridge this gap. However, it appears on nuclear deterrence that either the information given is insufficient or, more likely, not fully understood. Second is that by conflating debates such as nuclear deterrence and the nuclear deterrent immediately undermines political analysis. As such, nuclear deterrence is unquestioned and instead simply assumed, despite it being such a definite assertion of UK nuclear policy. Third is a more general point, that overall there is a worrying lack of definitions of key nuclear terms. Now, yes, these terms are in no way binary, therefore finding universal definitions would be very challenging. But the fact that there is not a genuine attempt to do so fundamentally undermines political understanding of nuclear issues, thereby damaging the production of nuclear policy. So, I will now briefly discuss the Prime Minister's understanding. As the person with the ultimate say over nuclear use, it is imperative that this individual has a comprehensive understanding of nuclear issues. For the purpose of this, I have focused on public statements made by Theresa May. As the person who is currently Prime Minister, she is the person who currently holds this nuclear privilege, albeit not for much longer. My research found that many of the same assumptions and lazy causal links made in the 2016 debate were also made by the Prime Minister when she spoke publicly on nuclear deterrence or Trident. For example, May spoke of, and I quote, the necessity for us to have our nuclear deterrent, which has been a cornerstone, an ultimate insurance policy of this country for nearly 50 years. Now, such a quote demonstrates a repeated conflation of the terms nuclear deterrence and the nuclear deterrent, as well as an unquestioning because it has been argument. Moreover, during this time period, nuclear technical capabilities have improved dramatically. Therefore, nuclear deterrence today is very different to what it was in 1945, and to assume that it is the same is misplaced. Now, whilst improving overall political understanding of nuclear deterrence may be too big of an ask, deepening the understanding of key nuclear decision makers is not. A concentrated effort to enhance the understanding of key ministers and their advisors would be to the ultimate benefit of UK nuclear policy. Now, it can be argued in response to these findings that effective policy analysis does not occur at the politician's level, or at least not in public. However, if this is true, the failure of that debate still to enhance the understanding of politicians shows that it is a deficiency which needs addressing. So, in conclusion, although analysis of nuclear issues does happen, the failure of this debate to enhance the understanding of politicians shows it is a deficiency which needs to be addressed. Political and academic spheres need to find new ways of informing one another so that political understanding can be enhanced by academic research and vice versa. In particular, a more concentrated effort in improving the understanding of key nuclear decision makers and their advisors would be to the ultimate benefit of UK nuclear policy. Having political knowledge resting primarily upon unquestioned assumptions, conflated debates, and historical precedent presents a concerning dynamic in the production of UK nuclear policy. To overcome this, addressing the lack of nuclear definitions would be a very good starting point. With increasing fears over non-proliferation, the return of aggressive nuclear signalling, and the loss of major arms control treaties, political understanding is required to go deeper than simply Trident does what it says on the tin. It deters. Thank you.
Okay, hello. Thank you very much for being here. I realize I'm the last speech before the coffee break, so I'm going to try to keep it super exciting without having a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm just going to make a few maybe a bit provocative statements. So, In this presentation, I'm going to speak about the UK's response to the Nuclear Ban Treaty, or the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And the presentation and the paper I'm talking about is part of a wider research project that I'm pursuing with Jan Ruzicka, who's sitting in the back, smiling encouragingly, I think, on nuclear stigmatization, in which we're looking at various stigmatization processes that have occurred in response to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In this paper today, on the presentation today, we're talking about the UK's response to the Ban Treaty. So the presentation is structured into 3 simple parts. In the first part, I'm going to introduce the Ban Treaty very briefly and introduce the framing of the United Kingdom as an ontologically insecure nuclear power. In the second part, I'm going to summarize the UK's response to the Ban Treaty. And in the third part, I'm going to draw some implications from the specific response. So basically, I'm going to talk a bit about, well, why does it matter how they respond? So part 1, the Humanitarian Initiative on Nuclear Weapons and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or in short, TPNW, aim to reframe the debate about nuclear weapons and disarmament to highlight the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons use. So this new disarmament movement assumes that by stigmatizing and ideally prohibiting nuclear weapons, they can bring the world closer to global nuclear zero. None of the nuclear-armed states have supported this movement. In fact, states such as Russia, the US, France, China, and the UK have driven a vigorous counter-stigmatization campaign against the TPNW. The UK has been part of this group of nuclear-armed states opposing the Ban Treaty, but we claim they have spoken from a quite unique position of a presumably ontologically insecure nuclear power. Now, what does ontologically insecure mean? We argue it means that the UK's status as a nuclear weapon state has been publicly contested more than in other cases. And we propose that this framing is based on 5 elements. So firstly, political parties such as part of the Labour Party and the CND, the Scottish National Party, publicly contest that the UK is a nuclear weapon state. Secondly, a strong civil society sector has been advocating nuclear disarmament for a very long time. So you could think about organizations such as CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, the Women's League for International Peace and Freedom, or most recently, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or in short, ICAN. Thirdly, the UK is officially committed to actually disarm its nuclear weapons eventually. Fourth, the British strategic rationale for maintaining nuclear weapons has become weaker, specifically due to the absence of the Soviet threat. And lastly, fifth, and most importantly for this presentation, the UK's possession of nuclear weapons has always been driven by the desire to maintain a strong strategic link with the United States. So if you think about other nuclear weapon states, such as France, that have acquired nuclear weapons as a way to detach from US influence, the British nuclear weapons has always served as a way to maintain a strong strategic link with the US. Now, I should state that ontological insecurity is a relative category, and this speaks a bit to the keynote we heard earlier. We're not claiming that the UK is just about to give up its nuclear weapons. What we're saying is the UK is relatively ontologically insecure in its nuclear status more than other cases. There's still a very strong support for the UK's nuclear force in the country, and the support recently manifested in the country's response to the Nuclear Ban Treaty, so the most recent disarmament movement. Now, this brings me to the second part of my presentation. How has the UK actually responded to the treaty? The UK's response to the Nuclear Ban Treaty and the humanitarian movement on nuclear weapons has aligned with a collective P5 stigmatization process that rests on 4 main claims. So first, nuclear-armed states, in particular the nuclear-armed states under the NPT, argue that the Ban Treaty is dangerous because it disregards the wider security context and international environment. We heard a bit about this in the keynote earlier today. Secondly, nuclear-armed states claim that the Ban Treaty is destabilizing and undermines existing international structures, in particular the NPT. Thirdly, these states bring forward the claim that the Ban Treaty actually hinders disarmament progress and won't bring the world closer to nuclear zero. And lastly, they argue that the Ban Treaty is premature and or unrealistic because nuclear disarmament has to be a multilateral process. We can find various examples for how the UK uses this rhetoric if we look at statements they make at NPT review conferences or other occasions. And one example is how the FCO responded to the adoption of the treaty in June 2017. So you see, it's a very new treaty. It's only recently been adopted. And the FCO claimed, and I quote, if I find my quote. We will not sign the treaty which has been published today. As we have previously made very clear, we do not believe that this treaty will bring us closer to a world without nuclear weapons. This treaty fails to address the key issues that must first be overcome to achieve lasting global nuclear disarmament. End of quote. And during the recent NPT Prep Commission in 2019, the UK's delegation further highlighted that, and I quote them again, "We believe further progress towards a world without nuclear weapons can only be made through gradual multilateral disarmament within existing international frameworks, negotiated using a step-by-step approach which takes into account the wider global security context." End of quote. So we heard a bit of this again in the keynote earlier this morning. Now, we argue that the UK has aligned with other NPT nuclear-armed states in their response to the TPNW and indeed followed the United States' lead. And we can think about 3 diplomatic actions and discursive interventions that exemplify this. So first, the UK initially debated attending the Oslo Conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, but eventually decided to join the P5's boycott of the meeting. Second, the UK sent a delegation to the Vienna conference shortly after the United States had announced that they were attending. And since then, the UK has opposed the ban treaty in a strong affiliation with the United States. And the last point is, the UK has declared its support for the US-led Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament initiative, which emerged as the counter-disarmament project to the ban treaty. The UK's former Secretary of Defense, Des Brown, captured some of these points well when he, in 2014, talked about whether or not the UK would attend the Vienna Conference on the humanitarian impact. And he argued, I quote him, "In fact, I will tell you, from the point of view of the United Kingdom, if the US agrees to go, we will go. I mean, it is no coincidence that we have not made up our mind about each of the last 2 conferences until immediately after the United States had made their decision." End of quote. Now, having stated how the UK responded, what are the implications of this particular behavior? There's little the UK government could do to lessen the critique against its nuclear status that is continuously voiced by civil society and politicians with various party affiliations. However, the development of strong arguments for the necessity of maintaining a nuclear arsenal could strengthen the country's nuclear status. In response to the humanitarian initiative and the nuclear ban treaty, the UK has failed to bring forward such strong arguments. In fact, it appears the country has rather rehearsed disarmament rhetoric that it has been using for decades, and even more, rather than developing its own response to the specific new disarmament movement, they seem to have followed the United States' lead. We argue that this strategy perpetuates the UK's status as an ontologically insecure nuclear power. It further makes the UK a US follower and creates a dual dependency for the UK on its strategic relationship with the United States. First, the special relationship, which you heard about in the first speech shortly, the special relationship with the US forms the basis for the UK's justification of possessing nuclear weapons. Second, the country has so far failed to step out of the United States' shadow in defending its opposition towards the nuclear ban treaty. This diplomatic and discursive behavior deepens critics' suspicion that prestige aspirations, particularly in the UK's relationship to the US, are the main motive for possessing nuclear weapons. Now, the problem in this is that prestige aspirations and influence fall short of forming a publicly persuasive case for possessing nuclear weapons. Moreover, they are precisely the type of arguments that the humanitarian movement and ICANN are seeking to undermine. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for staying with me. I'm looking forward to your comments.